Do you know this man? He was the first known black doctor in Pittsburgh. He published the very first abolitionist newspaper west of the Alleghenies before becoming co-editor of Frederick Douglass's North Star. He was accepted into Harvard Medical School by Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes himself. He led an expedition in Africa. He was commissioned by President Abraham Lincoln to the rank of Major, making him the highest-ranking black man to serve in the Union Army during the entire Civil War. He came to be known as the father of black nationalism. Before Malcolm X, before Marcus Garvey, before W.E.B. Du Bois, there was Martin Robeson Delany. Why don't we know about this man? It's time we found out about him and a myriad of other incredible African Americans and their impact on the history of America and the world. I'm Waleed Jamal, and this is History's Flip Side. Doctor, abolitionist, newspaperman, historian, educator, African explorer, politician, poet, journalist, scientist, Civil War commander. Martin Robeson Delany was all these things and more. His accomplishments were immense, to some extent unbelievable. But what was most unbelievable about this man is that his achievements went completely ignored by the mainstream history books and the public at large. Until now.
We proceed to give a cursory history of the attainments, the civil, social, business, and professional, and literary attainments of colored men and women, and challenge comparison with the world, according to circumstances in times past and present.
Hello, welcome to History's Flip Side. I'm Waleed Jamal. On this particular episode of the Delany Papers, Martin Delany chronicles great black businessmen and mechanics in American history and of his present time, 1852. So, let's get into it. Practical utility of colored people in the present day, 1852, as members of society, businessmen, and mechanics. In calling attention to the practical utility of colored people of the present day, we shall not be general in our observations, but simply direct attention to a few particular instances in which colored persons have been responsibly engaged in extensive business or occupying useful positions, thus contributing to the general welfare of community at large, filling their places in society as men and women. It will studiously be borne in mind that our sole object in giving these cases publicity is to refute the objections urged against us, that we are not useful members of society, that we are consumers and not producers, that we contribute nothing to the general progress of man. No people who have enjoyed no greater opportunity for improvement could possibly have made greater progress in the same length of time than have done the colored people of the present day. A people laboring under many disadvantages may not be expected to present at once, especially before they have become entirely untrammeled, evidence of entire equality with more highly favored people. When Mr. Jefferson, the great American statesman and philosopher, was questioned by an English gentleman on the subject of American greatness, and referred to their literature as an evidence of inferiority to the more highly favored and long existing European nations. Mr. Jefferson's reply was, "When the United States have existed as long as a nation as Greece before she produced her Homer and Socrates, Rome before she produced her Virgil, Horace, and Cicero, and England before she produced her Pope, Dryden, and Bacon, then he might consider the comparison a just one. And all we shall ask is not to wait so long as this, not to wait until we become a nation at all, as so far as the United States are concerned, but only to unfetter our brethren and give us, the free men, an equal chance for emulation, and we will admit any comparison you may please to make in a quarter of a century after." Just want to stop and break that down for a second. What he was saying about that quarter of the century is that if you let the slaves go and let them be educated, uninterrupted, then you would have 4 million productive American citizens to add to the census. And if you want proof of that, look what happened after the Civil War. The schools opened, black people got educated, and next thing you know, you had black doctors, black lawyers, black congressmen like Robert Smalls. He didn't know how to read until he went to school after the Civil War. Before long, he was serving on the South Carolina State Legislature, became a congressman. He bought his master's house. He served on Congress for decades. Even after Reconstruction was over, he kept his seat in Congress. He was a major general and the commander-in-chief of the South Carolina State Militia. He was the collector of customs in Charleston. And you can't be ignorant and uneducated to do all those things. So, I don't think Martin Delany was too far off in his estimation. If they would just let the slaves go and become educated to become American citizens. Moving on. For a number of years, the late James Forten of Philadelphia was the proprietor of one of the principal sail manufactories, constantly employing a large number of men, black and white, supplying a large number of masters and owners of vessels with full rigging for their crafts. On the failure of an extensive house, Tea and Company, in that city, during the pressure which followed a removal of the deposits of the United States Treasury in 1837, Mr. Forten lost by that firm $9,000. Being himself in good circumstances at the time, hearing of the failure of old constant patrons, he called at the house. One of the proprietors, Mr. T, on his entering the warehouse door, came forward, taking him by the hand, observed, "Ah, Mr. Forten, it is useless to call on us. We are gone. We can do nothing." At which Mr. Forten remarked, "Sir, I hope you think better of me than to suppose me capable of calling on a friend to torture him in adversity. I came, sir, to express my regret at your misfortune and, if possible, to cheer you by words of encouragement. If your liabilities were all in my hands, you should never be under the necessity of closing business." Mr. Forten exchanged paper and signatures with some of the first businessmen in Philadelphia, and raised and educated a large and respectable family of sons and daughters, leaving an excellent widow. Joseph Casey, recently deceased, was the architect of his own fortune, and by industry and application to business became a money broker in the city of Philadelphia, who, becoming indisposed from a chronic affection, was obliged to retire from business for many years previous to his death. Had Mr. Cassie been favored with health, he doubtless would have become a very wealthy man. His name and paper was good in any house in the city, and there was no banker of moderate capital of more benefit to the business community than was Joseph Cassie. He also left a young and promising family of 5 sons, 1 daughter, a most excellent widow, and a fortune of $75,000, clear of all encumbrance. Stephen Smith, of the firm of Smith and Whipper, is a remarkable man in many respects, and decidedly the most wealthy colored man in the United States. Mr. Smith commenced business after he was 30 years of age, without the advantages of a good business education, but by application qualified himself for the arduous duties of his vocation. For many years, he has been known as the principal lumber merchant in Columbia, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and for several years past associated with W. Whipper, a gentleman of great force of character, talents, and business qualifications. Mr. Smith residing in Philadelphia. Smith and Whipper are very extensive businessmen and very valuable members of the community, both of Lancaster and Philadelphia counties. By the judicious investment of their capital, they keep in constant employment a large number of persons, purchasing many rafts at a time and many thousand bushels of coal. It is not only the laborer in drawing boards and the coal hauler and heaver that are here benefited by their capital, but the original owners of the lumber and coal purchased by them, and the large number of boatmen and raftsmen employed in bringing these commodities to market. In the winter of 1849, these gentlemen had in store several thousand bushels of coal, 2,250,000 feet of lumber, 22 of the finest merchantmen cars running on the railroad from Philadelphia to Baltimore, $9,000 worth of stock in the Columbia Bridge, $18,000 in stock in the Columbia Bank, and besides this, Mr. Smith was then the reputed owner of 52 good brick houses of various dimensions in the city of Philadelphia, besides several in the city of Lancaster and the town of Columbia. Mr. Smith's paper, or the paper of the firm, is good for any amount wherever they are known, and we have known gentlemen to present the paper of some of the best men in the city, which was cashed by him at sight. The principal active business attended to by Mr. S. in person is that of buying good negotiable paper and other paper and speculating in real estate. The business of the firm is attended to by Mr. Whipper, who is a relative. Take Smith and Whipper from Lancaster and Philadelphia counties, and the business community will experience a hiatus in its connection that may not be easily filled. Samuel T. Wilcox of Cincinnati, Ohio, also stands conspicuously among the most respectable businessmen of the day. Being yet a young man just scanning 40, he is one among the extraordinary men of the times, born, like most of the colored men in this country, in obscurity, of poor parents, raised without the assistance of a father, and to a commonplace business without the advantages of schools. By his own perseverance, he qualified himself to the extent that gave him an inclination to traffic, which he did for several years on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, investing his gains in real estate until he acquired a considerable property. For the purpose of extending his usefulness and at the same time pursuing a vocation more in accordance with his own desires, a few years since, he embarked in the wholesale and retail family grocery business, and now has the best general assortment and most extensive business house of the kind in the city of Cincinnati. The establishment is really beautiful, having the appearance more of an apothecary store than a grocery house. Mr. Wilcox has a pickling and preserving establishment besides, separate from his business house, owning a great deal of first-class real estate. There is no man in the community in which he lives that turns money to a greater advantage than Mr. Wilcox, and none by whom the community is more benefited for the amount of capital invested. He makes constant and heavy bills in Eastern houses, and there are doubtless now many merchants in New York, Boston, and Baltimore cities who have been dealing with S.T. Wilcox, and never, until the reading of this notice of him, knew that he was a colored man. He has never yet been East after his goods, but pursuing a policy which he has adopted orders them. But if deceived by an article, never deals with that same house again. He always gets a good article. The paper of Mr. Wilcox is good for any amount. Henry Boyd is also a man of great energy of character, the proprietor of an extensive bedstead manufactory, with a large capital invested, giving constant employment to 18 or 25 men, black and white. Some of the finest and handsomest articles of the bedstead in the city are at the establishment of Mr. Boyd. He fills orders from all parts of the West and South, his orders from the South being very heavy. He is the patentee, or holds the right of the patent bedsteads. And, like Mr. Wilcox, there are hundreds who deal with Mr. Boyd at a distance, who do not know that he is a colored man. Mr. Boyd is a useful member of society, and Cincinnati would not, if she could, be without him. He fills a place that every man is not capable of supplying, of whatever quarter of the globe his forefathers may have been denizens. Messrs. Knight and Bell of the same place, Cincinnati, Ohio, are very successful and excellent mechanics. In the spring of 1851, 1 year ago, they put their sealed proposal for plastering of the public buildings of the county of Hamilton, almshouse, etc., and got the contract, which required $10,000 security. In 1851. The work was finished in fine artistic style, in which a large number of mechanics and laborers were employed, while at the same time they were carrying on many other contracts of less extent in the city, the public buildings being some 4 miles out. They are men of stern integrity and highly respected in the community. David Jenkins of Columbus, Ohio, a good mechanic, painter, glazier, and paper hanger by trade, also received by contract the painting, glazing, and papering of some of the public buildings of the state in autumn 1847. He is much respected in the capital city of his state, being extensively patronized, having on contract the great Neal House, and many of the largest gentlemen's residences in the city and neighborhood to keep in finish. Mr. Jenkins is a very useful man and member of society. John C. Bowers, for many years, has been the proprietor of a fashionable merchant tailor house, who has associated with him in business his brother Thomas Bowers, said to be one of the best, if not the very best, mercers in the city. His style of cutting and fitting is preferred by the first businessmen and other gentlemen of Philadelphia, in whom their patrons principally consist. Mr. Cordovelle, for more than 25 years, was the leading mercer and tailor, reporter, and originator of fashions in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. The reported fashions of Cordovelle are said to have frequently become the leading fashions of Paris, and the writer was informed by Mr. B., a leading merchant tailor in a populous city,
that many of the Eastern American reports were nothing more than a copy, in some cases modified, of those of Cordovel. Mr. Cordovel has, for the last 4 or 5 years, been residing in France, living on a handsome fortune, the fruits of his genius, and, though retired from the business, it is said he still invents fashions for the Parisian reporters, which yields him annually a large income. William H. Riley of Philadelphia has been for years one of the leading fashionable gentlemen's bootmakers. Riley's style and cut of boots taking the preeminence in the estimation of a great many of the most fashionable and businessmen in the city. Mr. Riley is much of a gentleman and has acquired considerable means. James Prosser, Sr. of Philadelphia has long been the popular proprietor of a fashionable restaurant in the city. The name of James Prosser among the merchants of Philadelphia is inseparable with their daily hours of recreation and pleasure. Mr. Prosser is withal a most gentlemanly man, and has the happy faculty of treating his customers in such a manner that those who call once will be sure to call at his place again. His name in paper is good among the businessmen of the city. Henry Minton is also the proprietor of a fashionable restaurant and resort of businessmen and gentlemen of the city. The tables of Mr. Henry Minton are continually laden with the most choice offerings to epicures, and the saloon during certain hours of the day presents the appearance of a beehive. Such is the stir, din, and buzz among the throng of Chestnut Street gentlemen who flock in there to pay tribute at the shrine of bountifulness. Mr. Minton has acquired a notoriety even in that proud city, which makes his house one of the most popular resorts. Mr. Hill of Chillicothe, Ohio, was for years the leading tanner and currier in that section of country, buying up the hides of the surrounding country and giving employment to large numbers of men. Mr. Hill kept in constant employment a white clerk, who once a year took down, as was then the custom, one or more flatboats loaded with leather and other domestic produce, by which he realized large profits, accumulating a great deal of wealth. By endorsement, failure, and other mistransactions, Mr. Hill became reduced in circumstances and died in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 1845. He gave his children a liberal business education. Benjamin Richards, Sr. of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 40 years ago, 1812, was one of the leading businessmen of the place. Being a butcher by trade, he carried on the business extensively, employing a white clerk, and held a heavy contract with the United States, supplying the various military posts with provisions. Mr. Richards possessed a large property in real estate, and was at one time reputed very wealthy. He and the late General O.H., I believe that's O'Hare, being considered the most wealthy individuals of the place, Mr. Richards taking the precedence. The estate of General O.H. now being estimated at $7 million. Mr. Richards has been known to buy up a drove of cattle at one time. By mismanagement, he lost his estate, upon which many gentlemen are now living at ease in the city. So I want to stop right here because this guy, Benjamin Richards, Sr., was a very special man in Martin Delany's life. You see, Martin Delany married Ben Richards' granddaughter, Catherine Richards. You see, and at the time, he was beloved. He was a hell of a butcher, and he had gotten the contract with the military during the War of 1812, supplying the troops with food and other provisions. And the main reason he got the contract is because he had a way of curing meat that would preserve it longer. And it was an African recipe. Well, because in most cases, the competitors' beef
would be green or wormy, and Daddy Ben knew how to keep it preserved longer, and that made him the richest black man in Pittsburgh, Martin Delany's grandfather-in-law. William H. Topp of Albany, New York, has for several years been one of the leading merchant tailors of the city. Starting in the world without aid, he educated and qualified himself for business, and now has orders from all parts of the state, the city of New York not excepted, for Topp's style of clothing. Mr. Topp stands high in his community as a businessman and as a useful and upright member of society. His paper or endorsement is good at any time. Henry Scott and Company of New York City have for many years been engaged extensively in the pickling business, keeping constantly in warehouse a very heavy stock of articles in their line. He, like the most of others, had no assistance at the commencement, but by manly determination and perseverance, raised himself to what he is. His business is principally confined to supplying vessels with articles and provisions in his line of business, which in this great metropolis is very great. There have doubtless been many a purser who cashed and filed in his office the bill of Henry Scott without ever dreaming of his being a colored man. Mr. Scott is extensively known in the great city and respected as an upright, prompt, energetic businessman and highly esteemed by all who know him. Mr. Hudson, for many years, kept in New York an intelligence office. At his demise, he was succeeded by Philip A. Bell, who continues to keep one of the leading offices in the city. Mr. Bell is an excellent businessman, talented, prompt, shrewd, and full of tact. And what seems to be a trait of character only to be found associated with talent. Mr. Bell is highly sensitive and very eccentric. A warm, good-hearted man, he has not only enlisted the friendship of his patrons, but also endeared himself to the multitude of persons who continually throng his office seeking situations. One of his usual expressions to the young women and men in addressing himself to them is, "My child." This is kind and philanthropic and has a tendency to make himself liked. His business is very extensive, being sought from all parts of the city by the first people of the community. It is said to be not unusual for the peasantry of Liverpool to speak of Mr. Bell as a benefactor of the emigrant domestics. Mr. Bell is extensively known in the business community, none more so and highly esteemed as a valuable citizen. Thomas Downing, for 30 years in the city of New York, has been proprietor of one of the leading restaurants. His establishment, situated in the midst of the Wall Street bankers, the business has always been of a leading and profitable character. Mr. Downing has commanded great influence and much means, and it is said of him that he has made 3 fortunes. Benevolent, kind, and liberal-minded, his head was always willing, his heart ready, and his hands open to give. Mr. Downing is still very popular, doing a most excellent business, and highly respected throughout New York. Indeed, you scarcely hear any other establishment of the kind spoken other than Downing's. Henry M. Collins of the city of Pittsburgh stands among the men of note, and we could not complete this list of usefulness without the name of Mr. Collins. Raised a poor boy, thrown upon the uncertainties of chance, without example of precept, save such as the public at large presents, Mr. Collins quit his former vocation as a riverman, and without means except $150, and no assistance from any quarter, commenced speculating
in real estate. And though only rising 40, has done more to improve the 6th Ward of Pittsburgh than any other individual, save one, Captain W., who built on company capital. Mr. Collins was the first person who commenced erecting an improved style of buildings. Indeed, there was little else than old trees in that quarter of the city when Mr. Collins began. He continued to build and dispose of handsome dwellings until a different class of citizens entirely was attracted to that quarter of town, among them one of the oldest and most respectable and wealthy citizens, an ex-alderman. After this, the wealthy citizens turned their attention to the district, and now it is one of the most fashionable quarters of the city, and bids fair to become the preferred part for family residences. Mr. Collins' advice and counsel was solicited by some of the first lawyers and land speculators in matters of real estate. He has left or contemplates leaving Pittsburgh in April for California, where he intends entering extensively into land speculation and doubtless with the superior advantages of this place, if his success is but half what it was in the former. But a few years will find him counted among the wealthy. Mr. Collins is a highly valuable man in any community in which he may live, and he leaves Pittsburgh much to the regret of the leading citizens. Without capital, he had established such a reputation that his name and paper were good in some of the first banking houses. Owen A. Barrett of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is the original proprietor of B.A. Fahnestock's celebrated vermifuge. Mr. Fahnestock raised Mr. Barrett from childhood, instructing him in all the science of practical pharmacy, continuing him in his employment after manhood when Mr. Barrett discovered the sovereign remedy for lumbricoly, and as an act of gratitude to his benefactor, he communicated it to him, but not until he had fully tested its efficacy. The proprietor of the house, finding the remedy good, secured his patent, or copyright, or whatever is secured, and never in the history of remedies in the United States has any equal, at least in sale, this of B.A. Fahnestock's vermifuge. Mr. Fahnestock, like a gentleman and Christian, has kept Mr. Barrett in his extensive house, compounding this and other medicines for 16 or 18 years. In 1840, it was estimated that of this article alone, the concern had realized $85,000. Doubtless this is true, and certainly proves Mr. Barrett to be of benefit, not only in his community, but like many others we have mentioned, to the country and the world. There's a little footnote to that. Of this particular time, a black man could not obtain a patent. A patent was issued only to recognized United States citizens. So, Mr. Fahnestock obtained the patent in his name. Whew. Deep. I love this story. This guy here, Lewis Hayden of Boston, is well deserving a place among the examples of character here given. But 8 years ago, having emerged from bondage, he raised by his efforts, as an act of gratitude and duty, $650, the amount demanded by mutual agreement by the authorities in Kentucky as a ransom for Calvin Fairbanks, then in the state prison at Frankfort, accused for assisting him in effecting his escape. See, what he's saying here is that this guy Calvin Fairbanks, this white guy, helped Lewis Hayden escape, and this guy wound up going to prison for helping this guy escape. And the bail to get him out was $650. So while free, he went up to Boston, got around some people, raised that money, and got this guy out. He sprung him. Now that is just, it's just too heroic. That's the word I was looking for. That was heroic. Imagine you're in prison, you help somebody escape, you're sitting there, you're languishing in jail, and next thing you know, that guy that you helped escape gets you out. Oh, I love history. In 1848, he went to Boston, and having made acquaintance and gained confidence with several businessmen, Mr. Hayden opened a fashionable clothing house in Cambridge Street, where he has, within the last year, enlarged his establishment, being patronized by some of the most respectable citizens of that wealthy metropolis. Mr. Hayden has made considerable progress considering his disadvantages in his educational improvements. He has great energy of character and extensive information. Lewis Hayden, by perseverance, may yet become a very wealthy man. He is generally esteemed by the Boston people, all seeming to know him. George T. Downing, a gentleman of education and fine business attainments, is proprietor of one of the principal public houses and places of resort at Newport, Rhode Island, during the watering season. This fashionable establishment is spoken of as among the best conducted places in the country. The proprietor among the most gentlemanly. Edward V. Clark is among the most deserving and active businessmen in New York, and but a few years are required to place Mr. Clark in point of business importance among the first men in that city. His stock consists of jewelry and silverwares, and consequently are always valuable, requiring a heavy capital to keep up business. His name and paper has a respectable credit even among the urbane denizens of Wall Street. Now, this guy is very special. I love this guy. John Julius and Lady were for several years the proprietors of Concert Hall, a cafe, then the most fashionable resort for ladies and gentlemen in Pittsburgh. Mr. and Mrs. Julius held assemblies and balls attended by the first people of the city. Being himself a fine violinist and dancing master, he superintended the music and dancing. When General William Henry Harrison, in 1840, then the President-elect of the United States, visited that city, his levee to and reception of the ladies were held at Concert Hall, under the superintendence of Monsieur John and Madame Edna Julius, the colored host and hostess. No house was ever better conducted than under their fostering care and excellent management, and the citizens all much regretted their retirement from the establishment. In Penyon, Western New York, Messrs. William Platt and Joseph C. Cassie are said to be the leading lumber merchants of the place. Situated in the midst of the great improving country, their business extends and increases in importance every year. The latter gentleman was raised to the business by Smith and Whipper, the great lumber merchants of Columbia, Pennsylvania, where he was principal bookkeeper for several years. Mr. Cassie has the credit of being one of the best accountants and businessmen in the United States of his age. Doubtless, a few years' perseverance and strict application to business will find them ranked among the most influential men of their neighborhood. Anthony Weston of Charleston, South Carolina, has acquired an independent fortune by his mechanical ingenuity and skillful workmanship. About the year 1831, William Thomas Catto, mentioned in another place, commenced an improvement on a thrashing machine, when, on taking sick, Mr. Weston improved on it, to the extent of thrashing 1,000 bushels a day. This thrashing mill was commenced by a Yankee by the name of Emmons, who, failing to succeed Mr. Caddo, then a millwright, since a minister, improved it to the extent of thrashing 500 bushels a day when Mr. Weston took it in hand and brought it to the perfection stated, for the use of Colonel Benjamin Franklin Hunt, a distinguished lawyer of Charleston, upon whose plantation the machine was built and to whom it belonged. Anthony Weston is the greatest millwright in the South, being extensively employed far and near, and by Southern people thought the best in the United States. A colored man thought by Southerners to be the best at what he did. You see, the inferiority thing is just a policy thing. It's just something that they would say just to enforce the policies. But these people proved those policies wrong. DeReef and Howard are very extensive wood factors, keeping a large number of men employed, a regular clerk and bookkeeper, supplying the citizens' steamers, vessels, and factories of Charleston with fuel. In this business, a very heavy capital is invested, besides which they are the owners and proprietors of several vessels trading on the coast. They are men of great business habits and command a great deal of respect and influence in the city of Charleston. There is nothing more common in the city of New Orleans than colored clerks, salesmen, and businessmen. In many stores on Chartier Camp and other business streets, there may always be seen colored men and women as salesmen and saleswomen behind the counter. Several of the largest cotton press houses have colored clerks in them. And on the arrival of steamers at the levees, among the first to board them, to take down the manifestos, and to make their transfers, are colored clerks. In 1839 and 40, one of the most respectable brokers and bankers of the city was a black gentleman, Mr. William Goodrich of York, Pennsylvania, has considerable interest in the branch of the Baltimore Railroad from Lancaster. In 1849, he had a warehouse in York and owned 10 first-rate merchandise cars on the road, doing a fine business. His son, Glenalvin G. Goodrich, a young man of good education, is a good artist and proprietor of a daguerreotype gallery. Certainly, there need be no further proofs required, at least in this department, to show the claims and practical utility of colored people as citizen members of society. We have shown that in proportion to their numbers, they vie and compare favorably in point of means and possessions with the class of citizens who, from chance of superior advantages, have studiously contrived to oppress and deprive them of equal rights and privileges in common with themselves. Thank you for watching this episode of History's Flipsides docuseries, The Delany Papers, based on the book originally published in 1852 by Dr. Martin Robeson Delany. I'd like to thank my brand new subscribers and my long-time subscribers. A special thank you to you two for hanging in there. We've got a heck of a lot of content coming your way. Please like, share, subscribe, and you can support the channel by ordering the book, which will be available in March. And as opposed to the original book, this book will be illustrated with a good deal of pictures of the people talked about in the book. I was able to find a great deal of images of the people talked about in this chapter, but I do apologize for the absence of images of so many others that I couldn't find in the book. However, if that person is from your hometown that I talked about, go to your local library's archives, and maybe, just maybe, there's a picture of them there. If so, get at me. Send it to me at Gator1on1
historyflipside@gmail.com. Give me a little brief bio of the person and send it along to me, and I'll be glad to spotlight them on History's Flip Side.